Starting with number 1, Carro Armato L3-35. Italy, 1935. Italy entered the war with more confidence in its tankettes than the battlefield ever rewarded. The L3-35 was a two-man machine that traced its lineage back to British Carden Lloyd carriers, adapted by Fiat and Saldo into what Italian planners optimistically classified as a combat vehicle. Weighing just over 3 tons, armed with twin 8mm machine guns and protected by armor no thicker than 13mm, it was outclassed before the first shot of the war was fired. In Ethiopia, it performed adequately against poorly armed opponents, but in North Africa and Greece, Allied anti-tank rifles penetrated its hull with ease. Crews described the interior as suffocating, with almost no visibility and no escape route under fire. Italian tankette crews in North Africa suffered disproportionate casualties precisely because the L3-35 gave the appearance of protection while providing almost none. Number 2, Panzer Kampfwagen I, Germany, 1934. Germany built the Panzer I not as a weapon of war but as a training vehicle, a platform on which the Wehrmacht could develop armored doctrine while heavier designs were still on the drawing board. What no one anticipated was how thoroughly the Reich's ambitions would outrun its industrial timeline. When the Spanish Civil War began, Panzers were sent to support nationalist forces, and the results were sobering. Armed only with 2 MG-13 machine guns and protected by 13mm of armor, they were destroyed in numbers by Soviet-supplied T-26 tanks, which outgunned them entirely. By the invasion of Poland, German commanders already understood the Panzer I was obsolete, yet the vehicle made up a significant portion of the armored force. In France in 1940, Panzers were still present in combat, where any Allied anti-tank gun could penetrate them at virtually any combat range. Crews who survived those engagements rarely described the experience without acknowledging they had been fortunate rather than well-equipped. Number 3, T-60, Soviet Union, 1941. The T-60 arrived in Soviet service during one of the most desperate periods in the history of the Red Army. With tank factories relocating east under German bombardment and frontline losses running into the thousands, Soviet planners needed something with tracks and a gun that could be built immediately. The T-60 was that answer, and it was a compromise from the first weld. Its 20mm SHVK cannon was insufficient against anything heavier than light German vehicles, and its armor of 20 to 35mm offered limited protection in direct engagements. Soviet crews called it the Mass Grave for Two, a bitter acknowledgement that the vehicle's two-man crew had little chance of survival in serious combat. Despite this, T-60s were committed to battle around Moscow and Leningrad because there was simply nothing else available. The tank's light weight allowed it to cross ice and terrain impassable to heavier vehicles, and in that narrow operational role it served. But in any conventional tank engagement, the T-60 was a death sentence for the men inside it. Number 4, Mark I Mail, United Kingdom, 1916. The Mark I was not a failure of intent. It was the first tank ever used in combat, and history rightly credits it as a revolutionary concept. But revolution and reliability are rarely the same thing. When British forces committed the Mark I to battle at the Somme in September 1916, mechanical attrition immediately revealed how immature the design was. Of the 49 vehicles that reached the start line, only 32 made it forward, and a significant number of those broke down before achieving anything meaningful. The interior of the Mark I subjected its 8-man crew to conditions that bordered on physiological torture. Engine fumes filled the fighting compartment continuously. Temperatures regularly exceeded 50 degrees Celsius, and the noise was so severe that crew communication required prearranged hand signals. Carbon monoxide poisoning disabled crews during engagements. The armor, while adequate against small arms fire, was not proof against armor-piercing rounds the Germans quickly developed in response. The Mark I mattered enormously as a concept, but the men who crewed it paid a severe physical price for the privilege of pioneering armored warfare. Number 5, FCM-36, France, 1936. France in the interwar period built tanks according to a philosophy that prioritized infantry support above all else, and the FCM-36 embodied that doctrine completely. It was a two-man light tank with a 37mm gun, welded construction that was genuinely advanced for its time, and diesel power that reduced fire risk. On paper it represented thoughtful engineering. In practice, the two-man crew configuration was its undoing. The commander was also required to serve as the gunner and loader simultaneously, a demand that made effective combat almost impossible. In the chaos of the 1940 campaign, FCM-36 crews operating against the advancing Wehrmacht found they could not acquire targets targets, load their weapon, and communicate with other vehicles at the same time. The tank's tactical ceiling was simply too low for the mobile warfare that France was suddenly forced to fight. Dozens of FCM-30 SIXS were abandoned or destroyed during the collapse, not because the vehicle was mechanically unreliable, but because its fundamental crew arrangement made it incapable of competing with German armored tactics. Number 6. Vickers Light Tank Mk6, United Kingdom, 1936. By 1940, the Vickers Light Tank Mk6 was the most numerous armored vehicle in the British Army, and that numerical strength concealed a profound operational weakness. Armed with a .50 caliber and .303 caliber machine gun combination and protected by armor between 4 and 15 millimeters thick, the Mk6 had been designed for imperial policing duties in the colonies, where it faced no serious armored opposition. In the Western Desert and during the fall of France, it faced Panzer IIIs and IVs. The results were predictably catastrophic. At the Battle of Arras and across North Africa in the early desert campaigns, MKVs were destroyed in large numbers because their armament could not penetrate German tanks and their armor could not resist German guns. British crews understood they were being sent into engagements with vehicles that had no realistic chance against their opponents. The MKVI's continued frontline deployment well into a war it was never designed for represents one of the more consequential failures of British pre-war armored planning. Number 7. Renault R35, France, 1935. The Renault R35 was the French Army's primary light infantry tank when Germany invaded in May 1940, and its presence in those numbers illustrated precisely what was wrong with French armored doctrine. With a crew of 2, a short-barreled 37mm gun that struggled against German medium tanks, and a maximum speed of 20 km per hour, the R-35 was built for a slow, deliberate war of position that Germany refused to fight. In theory, the R-35 was reasonably armored for its class, with 40mm on the turret face. In practice, being well-armored meant nothing when the tank could not move fast enough to concentrate force or withdraw under pressure. Hundreds of R-35s were captured intact when French crews, unable to maneuver or react to the speed of German advances, simply ran out of fuel or became isolated. The German army subsequently pressed captured R-35s into their own service, using them for occupation duties and anti-partisan operations, a post-war indignity that summarized the vehicle's entire trajectory. Number 8. Type 94 Tankette, Japan, 1934. Japan's Type 94 was designed for logistical support and infantry accompaniment in the specific terrain conditions of Manchuria and China, where its opponents were lightly armed and largely without anti-armor capability. Against that context, the Type 94 performed its intended role with reasonable adequacy. But Japan made the strategic miscalculation of continuing to rely on tankettes and light armor as the Pacific War expanded into engagements against American forces equipped with far superior weapons. The Type 94, weighing barely 3.5 tons and armed with a 6.5mm machine gun, was irrelevant against American M4 Shermans. At Guadalcanal and subsequent island campaigns, Japanese armor including Type 94 variants was destroyed almost without exception whenever it engaged American defensive positions. Crews' survival rates in these engagements were extremely low. The Type 94's failure in the Pacific was not a mechanical failure but a doctrinal one. Japan persisted with a family of vehicles suited for one war long after a completely different war demanded something else. Number 9. Panzerkampfwagen II, Germany, 1936. The Panzer II, like its predecessor, was a stopgap that became a liability when kept in service longer than its designers intended. Armed with a 20mm autocannon and protected by armor up to 35mm on early variants, it was considered marginally more combat capable than the Panzer I, and during the Polish campaign it served adequately in that limited context. But in France, North Africa, and the opening months of Operation Barbarossa, the Panzer II encountered tanks that simply outclassed it in every category that mattered. The Soviet T-34 and KV-1 were effectively immune to its gun at most combat ranges. British Matildas in North Africa presented similar problems. German crews in Panzer IIs during Barbarossa often reported engaging Soviet tanks repeatedly without achieving penetration, while a single Soviet round at any reasonable distance ended the engagement permanently. The Panzer II remained in frontline service through 1942 in some theaters, a decision that cost German tank crews their lives in situations where a heavier vehicle would have given them a fighting chance. Number 10. A11 Infantry Tank Matilda I, United Kingdom, 1938. The Matilda I was a tank that resolved one problem while creating several others. Its armor, up to 60 mm thick, was effectively immune to most German anti-tank weapons during the early campaigns in France, making it nearly impervious in frontal engagements in 1940. But the designers had achieved that protection at a severe cost. The Matilda I was armed only with a single .303 or .50 caliber machine gun, meaning it carried no anti-armor capability whatsoever. A tank that cannot kill other tanks is not a tank in any meaningful combat sense. Its maximum speed was 8 km/h, making it the slowest armored vehicle in serious British service. At the Battle of Arras in May 1940, Matilda is contributed to one of the few British tactical successes of the campaign, briefly causing panic in German lines. But their inability to prosecute that success, combined with their mechanical fragility over distance, meant the advantage evaporated. Commanders who ordered the Matilda I forward understood they were committing an essentially defensive vehicle to an offensive role it was never designed to fulfill. Number 11. Carro Armato M1340, Italy, 1940. Italy's M1340 represented a genuine attempt to field a medium tank capable of serious combat operations, and for a brief period in the Western Desert, it appeared to succeed. Armed with a 47 mm gun that could penetrate most British light armor of the period and protected by 30 to 40 mm of steel, it was not without capability. The problem was reliability, and in the North African desert, reliability was the difference between an armored force and a collection of burning metal. The M1340's engine was chronically underpowered and prone to overheating in desert temperatures. Electrical systems failed with regularity. The vehicle's turret design gave the commander extremely limited visibility. In Operation Compass in December 1940, British forces captured hundreds of M1340s, many abandoned due to mechanical failure rather than combat damage. The tank that Italy needed to compete in the desert required maintenance standards and spare parts supply chains that Italian logistics could never consistently provide. By the time adequate replacements arrived, Italian armored credibility in North Africa had been fundamentally compromised. Number 12. TOG-2, United Kingdom, 1941. The TOG-2 was a machine born from the wrong war. Designed by a committee of veterans from the First World War, it was intended to cross the churned, waterlogged battlefields of Flanders, the same terrain that had defined armored warfare between 1916 and 1918. By 1940, that vision of war was 2 decades obsolete. The TOG-2, standing for the Old Gang, a self-deprecating nickname used by its own designers, weighed 81 tons, making it heavier than any tank that entered production in Britain during the war. Its maximum speed was barely 8.5 km/h, although it eventually received a 17-pounder gun that was one of the most effective anti-armor weapons of the war. The vehicle's mobility was so severely compromised that no military force could practically employ it. The TOG-2 never left prototype status, but its existence illustrates a recurring failure in British armor development, the tendency to optimize for the last war rather than the present one, a philosophical error that costs real resources and real time when both were critical. Number 13. Type 97 Chiha, Japan, 1937. The Type 97 Chiha was Japan's best medium tank of the war, and that qualification reveals the scale of Japan's armored problem more clearly than any critique. Armed with a 57 mm low-velocity gun optimized for infantry support rather than anti-armor work, and protected by 25 mm of homogeneous steel armor, the Chiha was a capable design against the opponents Japan faced in China. When the Pacific War brought Japanese armor into contact with American M4 Shermans, the inadequacy became devastating and immediate. The Chiha's gun could not reliably penetrate the Sherman's armor at standard combat ranges, while the Sherman's 75 mm gun destroyed Chiha's with routine efficiency. At Saipan, Tinian, and the Philippines, Japanese armored attacks built around Chiha formations were systematically destroyed. Japan did develop an upgun variant, the Chiha Kai, with a higher velocity 47 mm gun that partially addressed the anti-armor deficiency, but production numbers were insufficient and arrived too late to alter the fundamental imbalance that defined Japanese armored combat in the later Pacific campaigns. Number 14. T-70, Soviet Union, 1942. The T-70 was a direct acknowledgement that the T-60 had failed, and it was a marginal improvement at best. Replacing the inadequate 20 mm gun with a 45mm weapon and increasing armor protection to up to 60mm represented real progress. But the T-70 retained the same two-man crew arrangement that had made the T-60 so difficult to fight effectively. The commander continued to serve as gunner and loader simultaneously, limiting combat effectiveness in exactly the conditions where focused, rapid fire was most needed. Soviet crews respected the T-70 more than the T-60, but remained acutely aware of its limitations against German armor. The tank's 45mm gun could penetrate Panzer III's and early Panzer IV's under favorable conditions but struggled against later German armor. At Kursk in July 1943, T-70s participated in some of the largest armored engagements in history, and their losses were severe. Soviet commanders eventually relegated T-70s to reconnaissance and infantry support roles, an implicit admission that they could not be committed to heavy armored combat without unacceptable crew casualties. Number 15. LK-2, Germany, 1918. The LK-2 represents what German armor development might have achieved had the First World War continued into 1919. A light cavalry tank weighing approximately 9 tons, it was designed with a degree of mechanical reliability and speed that the heavy, lumbering A-7V entirely lacked. Armed with a 57mm gun in an early variant or machine guns in the infantry support version, the LK-2 demonstrated that German engineers had internalized lessons from Allied tank deployments and were moving toward a genuinely viable armored concept. Production was ordered for 580 vehicles, but the armistice of November 1918 ended manufacturing before any reached operational units. The LK-2's significance is therefore primarily historical. It demonstrates that Germany was converging on effective armored doctrine before the war's end, and that the tank gap between Germany and the Allies, so damaging to German operations in 1918, was already being addressed. Its failure was not one of design but of timing, though that timing proved decisive.